We're going to start to move into a discussion of agriculture, and we'll talk about different topics related to agriculture. We're going to start here in discussing something that's called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is really a shift in agricultural practices that took place in the 20th century, and it's sometimes called the Third Agricultural Revolution. And it happened, around the 1940s to the 1970s. And it started really in Mexico by a politician in 1940, I think it's Alfred Wallace, traveled to Mexico, and he was a Secretary of Agriculture and observed that in Mexico it took people working the land about 500 hours to produce a bushel of corn. And that was about 50 times more than it took farmers in Iowa to produce a bushel of corn. And so that started a process in which different technologies were used to increase the yields of crops. The corn that was being grown in Iowa was hybridized for the climate there. And so a man named Norman Borlaug started working in Mexico at increasing yields and helped to produce a new variety of corn, a hybridized variety that was bred to be successful in the Mexican climate. And along with other technological advances, started to really dramatically improve yields of these crops. Norman Borlaug won a Nobel Prize for his work on the Green Revolution. Some people will say that he is responsible for saving 1 billion lives in the world due to the increases in yields that prevented starvation. And other individuals also took the same sorts of ideas and hybridized rice and changed rice cultivation in Asia. And another individual spread Green Revolution practices to India as well. And it's not just the types of seeds being planted or these hybrid crops. There's a whole host of different technologies that started to become widespread around this time. And some of those are listed here. Mechanization, using equipment and tractors and so forth to mechanize the agricultural practices. Chemical, synthetic fertilizers that started to be produced are really important because these high yield varieties required far greater levels of nutrients in the soil, and so these synthetic chemical fertilizers were produced in order to facilitate that. Irrigation practices changed. Pesticides were developed to prevent the insects and other pests from damaging crops. And then the hybridization or the breeding of different varieties of crops that were higher yielding. And so we can see in these graphs some data about how crop production changed. This one on the left is in the United States. So this is 1960 to 2018. We could see the population change in the United States is here. We can see on this bottom graph the amount of land that was used to raise these crops actually declined in those 60 years or so. So we're using less land, but look at what the production of these crops is. It has increased dramatically, well over 200 times greater than it was in 1960. So those represent these improvements in yield that happened as these techniques took hold. We can see here on this graph on the right, this is again yield of different types of crops. You could see potatoes and corn, rice, wheat, soybeans, sugar beets, etc. over time. And what we see once you start getting into the Green Revolution in the 1940s and beyond, we see these rapid increase in yields of all of these crops. So that's what the Green Revolution is. And the Green Revolution, we're going to also hear, so yes, did it bring many people a sustainable food supply in terms of an adequate food supply? Yes, it certainly did. Saved many, many lives, billions of lives. But there are some negative consequences of the Green Revolution. We're going to watch some videos in class and we'll talk a little bit about what this basically industrialization of agriculture, how that impacted people and the earth. So these new methods of growing crops, which include increased mechanization, and the large scale, large corporations who can invest large amounts of capital can increase profits, can grow crops more efficiently. But also at the same time, it drastically increases the reliance on fossil fuels. Okay? Fertilizers require fossil fuels. All of this mechanization equipment requires fossil fuels. It requires more irrigation, which means extracting more groundwater. It requires smaller scale farmers to borrow money to purchase the more expensive equipment and fertilizers and pesticides and even seed that requires them to borrow money and become indebted. And that's a major factor in how the Green Revolution impacts small scale farms. Okay, and we'll talk about some of those impacts in our next topic.